stop me if you've heard this before. Back in the old day when we used to be kids, games were made for people that really put an effort into thinking about their games. I mean, you had to spend time reading in the game, you had to spend time brushing up on all sorts of things. What I'm saying is you needed a fairly high IQ to be able to get what the game was about, and probably a degree in computer engineering or computer science to get it up and running in the first place. I mean, who even knows at this time what the hierarchy of their sound card is? Who even bothers with that? Back in the old days, you had to put some effort into it, and that's why games back then were better, because you had to think about them constantly. You had to put an effort in there, you had to work for it, and you'd be smarter because of it. I'm sure you've heard this idea before. I'm not saying it's wrong, and not entirely wrong. Games back in the day did require more from you, a bit more engagement other than just pressing the buttons, than just going through the motions. You needed to understand bits of it because it did not really offer you some measure of convenience, like let's say a logbook where you would automatically find all the dialogue, all the quests, everything you've ever accomplished or encountered in your adventure. You would have to be the one that kept track of those. You would have to remember things. You would have to pay attention. You would have to take note. You would have to go out and see if the things you took note of were actually something that you were supposed to find in game, or was just some offhand remark by an NPC just to give the world a bit more fluff. It was up to you. And in that way, yeah, it did make you live a bit more in the game's world. It made you want to understand it a bit more. And you also had combat systems that were, in some cases, deep enough to really get you invested. But the thing is, video games also needed to sell, and as the audience grew in numbers, there came the realization that you couldn't really sell the same kind of game you used to make 30 years ago to the people that we have now. The people that did not grow up configuring their sound cards RIQ, DMA, or port. You need to sell games to people that are in it just to play a game. So a shift happened, I would say. I call this show the Caius Cosades Conundrum because they all start with C and it's funny that way. And because, well, there was a conundrum relating to Caius Cosades. He is the blades guy that you have to find in Morrowind once you exit the tutorial area. He is essentially your first main quest. Go to Caius Cosades in Balmora. His house is over the bridge on the left. Well, you have to go right a bit, then up the stairs and then left. It's the first or second house. He's in there, he's shirtless, ripped, and I'm just now noticing this. For an old guy, Caius Cosades was ripped. I mean, he had some pecs on him. Everybody in Morrowind was kind of like really buff. They lifted, bro, a lot. But what I'm trying to say is that to get to Caius Cosades, you had to know where he was. The game told you where he was, but you, the player, had to know. The game would not constantly indicate where he is. It would not show you the direction. It would not give you pointers visually on the map, on the screen in the world to where he is. You were the one that had to find him. And as the legend goes, and I'm saying legend because I didn't really have time to get into the details of exactly what was the reaction like, the mass reaction exactly back then in the public I'm thinking of. Well, I've done a tiny bit of research and it sounds like it's true because people are still doing this. A lot of people could not find them. And he is essentially the first quest in the game, and people could not find them. And because of that, a segment of the audience was put off by the game, by its apparent impenetrableness, if that's how you pronounce the word. The idea of being impenetrable to the general people trying to play, to the general audience. And that was a problem, because Morrowind sold okay, but once they solved that problem, once they added the all-encompassing compass that's everywhere right now, the sales of the game, the next one, Oblivion, shot up like a bottle rocket filled with menthos and kerosene lit on fire. Sure, they did also tweak the small fact that it's more physics oriented in terms of combat than rolling the dice to see if what you actually did in the game coincides with what the game says you did, but it's sort of in the same ballpark. It removes complexity for the sake of being more penetrable, more digestible, if you will. In the process, we have lost the sheer fun, I would say, fun for some, of exploration, of being able to, not being able to, but needing to, being rewarded for understanding the world and understanding the game itself. Though that's not really fair because the games still do that. They still reward you for trying to understand, to take a step further. But you don't feel it as well because the majority of what you'll be doing is simplified. It is lesser in terms of the effort you have to put in and the reward you get out of the effort. You may interpret this as a way of me saying that games got stupider, but I don't think there was a choice in regards to that simplification because since the olden days, the games that had the most success were the ones that had the broadest appeal possible. Take Tetris for example. It is a game that makes you think. You have to think about how you put the pieces in, but you don't really think about it. Take any arcade action game, any puzzle game even, they all require you to think. They all require engagement from you. They all need you to actively try and figure out what this is about, what you have to do, how everything works, how are you going to succeed. But there is a limit to how much effort you need to put into that before it becomes playable and enjoyable. There is a very low limit. And games that have a low limit, I would say maybe a low threshold, if you will, of accessibility, they're the ones that become popular. They're the ones that are enjoyed by the largest amount of people and therefore become successful. That's not to say that you can't have a high ceiling of effort that can be put into a game, into understanding it, into figuring out its world, its mechanic, its everything. There absolutely is. There can be. Take World of Warcraft for example. It's an easy game to get into. It's quite simple to understand. It's virtually effortless. That is why it became incredibly successful. But as you've probably seen if you were ever in a big raid or at least seen a screenshot of a raid, you get to a level where there are so many boxes and so many interface elements on the screen that you no longer see the game. You see basically a spreadsheet that's being modified in real time with the HP of the enemies and the players, and there's complexity there. There's an extra layer there that you reach once you get accustomed to the game. It doesn't front load its difficulty, and that's a problem that a lot of games may have. They sometimes front load their difficulty, which makes them unappealing. Like for example, Doom. The first level is quite easy. The first couple of seconds are quite easy. Compare this to System Shock, which in my opinion is a more enjoyable game to me. To even equip a weapon in the game takes a lot more effort than it does in Doom. Requires a lot more time, requires you to use a lot more of the keyboard. It is considerably more fiddly, especially back in the olden days because it didn't have proper mouse look interface support. Now it does in the enhanced-ish version. And that's just a quality of life thing. Adding proper mouse look support to System Shock does not make it a lesser game, doesn't make it less complex, less enjoyable, less beautiful. It actually makes it more playable, it makes it more accessible, it makes it easier for everybody to get into. Well, again, maybe not everybody because it's still a System Shock. It's still gonna be a lot deeper than most games are in terms of the complexity of its gameplay and the effort you need to put into it to actually be able to progress. And the majority of the population won't be into that. The majority of the population plays a game to take their mind off something. That's why Tetris is so popular. That's why Solitaire is so popular. People just play them to play them. They don't want necessarily a super duper epic mega super grand adventure that requires them to unlock the inner mysteries of the human element and unlock the third eye or something. I don't know. They just want to spend time in front of a screen blowing something up. So that's why the majority of the games that are popular now are more of no, that's not correct. The games that have always been popular, always, were the ones that you could just turn your brain off and enjoy. It's the same thing with movies. They don't all have to be Memento. I think it's the only one that comes to mind and maybe a bit more complicated. Inception wasn't complicated. Neither was Interstellar. They just have to be enjoyable. And when it comes to the enjoyment that you can get out of a game, it's really hard to compete with something like Call of Duty's multiplayer. The simple deathmatch, or not necessarily just Call of Duty, but that style of play. The one you see in Crossfire and Alliance of Valiant Arms and pretty much every free or non-free online multiplayer deathmatch game. You go in, it really doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a game, doesn't matter if you're at the beginning of a game, doesn't matter if you're gonna do good in a round, doesn't matter if you're gonna fail completely in a round. If you can go in and run around and shoot some stuff and give your brain some breathing room for a while, it's fine. And that is the most attractive aspect that games have to a lot of people. A whole lot of people, a crazy amount of a lot of people. That's not to say that you can't build complexity on top of that you can't make a game that is trying to be about something on top of that. It's trying to add some value above that. You absolutely can. World of Warcraft can be one such example. There's some nifty quests in Skyrim and Oblivion, I would say. And when you break it right down, Divinity Original Sin is a very accessible game in terms of its, well, everything, and yet still manages to have depths of complexity built into it. They'll make it enjoyable now and forever. Now sure, you could have had a bit more of an oomph in terms of the storytelling, the tone. Some people will always say that it's a bit too cartoony, but you can't really make a game for everybody. It's actually quite hard to do that. And the game did have a lot of success, though nowhere near the amount of success that any action game will ever have. Because an action game is something that you don't really need to explain to people to understand. You don't need to sell them on the idea of an action game. You don't need to sell them on the idea of Tetris. You just show them the game and they will instantly get it. And because you get it, odds are you will try to play it. That's a difficult element that the games that I grew up with may have a problem with. Not everybody's gonna find Caius Cosades. Not everybody has the time to learn the geography of this alien-looking world. Sometimes they just want to go out and kill some bugs. And in that case, well, Morrowind may not be the game for them, but somebody needs to make the game for them. And in the case of Morrowind, its successors became that game. They saw the audience wasn't being served, and by the audience I mean a lot of people. Vastly superior numbers to the ones that were being served up until now, with some overlapping elements as well. And so they acted, and with some sacrifices they made a game that many people can enjoy. And that in itself also sort of left a niche in the market that somebody else can fill now. Well, people have been trying to fill it for years. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop moaning about how the big companies that need to sell large numbers of games to stay in business are actively trying to sell a large number of games. Because if they don't cater to our needs, you just know that there's gonna be a smaller developer out there that's in the same position that the big players were when they were smaller. And they will. There's a game out there for everybody. And mainstream just may not be that. Because the mainstream games need to be something for everyone. Or at least for as many of that everyone as possible. Now sure, some companies could still make the games that they used to make by just refusing to grow, to expand, to capitalize on their success and just remain as they are. With a lot more money, but not really able to use it all to create a bigger, better product. It's the situation that Telltale was in. Their games had moderate success. They were okay when they made Sam & Max, when they made Wallace and Gromit, Strong Bad, but it was getting very big licenses and doing actual proper games with them, not we don't talk about Jurassic Park, and making those games accessible enough to everyone. That's what brought them real success. Back to the Future still had puzzles in it, but they were simplified. They were easy puzzles. There were puzzles you could do in an episodic game, solved quite easily. That was, at the time, their most successful game. And because of it, they grew. And they started down that path and kept growing and making games that were mechanically simpler and simpler until they reached The Walking Dead, which was their greatest creation. And from that point, they Well, they kept growing and growing, but they never took another step in terms of expanding the gameplay to a broader audience. Even though I don't know how they would actually do that while still maintaining the same recipe. They probably need to change the recipe, make it something different, and they didn't. And when the game stopped selling as much, problems started showing up, especially since they were making a lot of games and there were a lot of people there. This wasn't the 10-man team they used to have back in the day. It was 300, 200 people. Instead of expanding, they maybe should have remained a bit more focused, a bit more concentrated on simpler ideas, which is something that you see from a lot of smaller developers. Spiderweb Software, for example, it's still primarily 3 people, and one of them just basically does the accounting, and it's been making games since the early 90s. Games that have changed bit by bit, but have always maintained that thing that made them niche to begin with. They're not games for everybody, they're games for very specific people, and that's where their success lies. They don't go beyond what those specific people can support, because if they did, they would need to target less specific people. And that's the trap of the video games industry. If at any point you make the decision that you have to go bigger for a project, you also have to go broader for the audience. You have no choice. It is a trap. It is the Caius Cosades Conundrum, and it is everywhere, even in making stupid videos on YouTube. Goodbye.